Hi everyone, it's Donovan. Today, we journey into the heart of rural Appalachia, to Pike County, Ohio, a place of quiet, rolling hills, dense forests, and tight-knit communities, which, in the spring of 2016, became the unwilling stage for one of the most horrific, calculated, and complex mass murders in Ohio's history. This is the story of the Pike County Massacre, also known as the Rhoden family murders, a case that involved the execution-style killings of 8 people, a sprawling, multi-year investigation that would test the limits of local law enforcement, and a motive ultimately rooted in a bitter, obsessive family dispute over the custody of a child. On a seemingly peaceful spring day, April 22nd, 2016, the ingrained tranquility of this southern Ohio region, an area deeply characterized by the western foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and a culture of self-reliance, was brutally and irrevocably shattered. 8 members of the extended Rhoden family, across 4 different homes nestled in the rural landscape, were discovered murdered in cold blood. The killings were not random acts of violence. They were targeted, meticulously planned, and executed with a chilling precision that bespoke a deep-seated vendetta. The victims, whose lives were so cruelly extinguished, were Christopher Rhoden Sr., 40, a father and local businessman, his ex-wife, Dana Manley Rhoden, 37, with whom he still maintained a complex relationship, their 3 children, Clarence Frankie Rhoden, 20, a new father himself, Hanna Rhoden, 19, a young mother, and Christopher Rhoden Jr., just 16 years old. Also counted among the dead were Frankie Rhoden's fiancée, Hanna Hazel Gilley, 20, Christopher Sr.'s older brother, Kenneth Rhoden, 44, and a cousin, Gary Rhoden, 38. In a small, yet poignant mercy amidst the widespread carnage, 3 young children, Hanna May's newborn daughter, just 4 days old, her cherubic 2-year-old daughter Sophie, and Frankie and Hazel's 6-month-old son, were found unharmed at the scenes, deliberately spared by the killers. A decision that would later add another layer of complexity to the unfolding mystery. The grim discoveries began when Bobby Jo Manley, Dana Rhoden's sister, drove out to feed animals at Chris Rhoden Sr.'s property on Union Hill Road that Friday morning. A routine act of familial support, accompanied by a friend, Billy Morgan. She immediately sensed something was terribly amiss. Dogs that should have been secured inside were roaming freely outside. And Chris Sr.'s truck, usually gone by that hour, remained parked in the driveway. An unsettling quiet hung in the air. Steeling themselves, they entered the home, only to find a trail of blood leading from the living room, where a recliner had been inexplicably moved, through the kitchen, and into Chris Sr.'s bedroom. There, they found him and his cousin Gary, both dead, partially covered by a comforter. Bobby Jo's frantic 911 call captured her raw horror and disbelief. "There's blood. My brother-in-law's in the bedroom. It looks like someone has beat the hell out of him. I think they're both dead." Her voice trembled as she conveyed the unthinkable. The horror compounded exponentially as more family members were checked on. Bobby Jo, reeling from her discovery, rushed to Frankie Rhoden and Hanna Gilley's nearby trailer, only to find the young couple shot in their bed, their infant son and Frankie's older child alive, but now orphaned beside them, unable to reach her sister, Dana Rhoden. By phone, Bobby Jo contacted her brother, James Manley. He, in turn, drove to Dana's new home, needing to inform her of the unfolding nightmare. The front door was ajar, walking into the silent house. calling Dana's name to no response. He made his way to her bedroom. It was dark. He approached the bed, reached to move the pillow from beneath his sister's head, then paused. A dreadful certainty gripping him. Overwhelmed, he retreated, fetched his wife, and then flagged down police officers who were by then converging on the area. These officers entered Dana's home to find not only Dana, but also her children, Hanna Mae and Chris Jr. Each shot at close range, mirroring the brutal efficiency seen at the other locations. Hanna Mae's newborn daughter, a tiny life amidst profound tragedy, was found alive, nestled beside her deceased mother. The final victim, Kenneth Rhoden, was found later that afternoon at his own residence on Left Fork Road by his cousin, Donald Stone, after widespread concern grew when he, too, couldn't be reached as news of the massacre spread like wildfire through the shocked community. Pike County, a predominantly rural area with limited law enforcement resources, was immediately overwhelmed by the scale and brutality of the crime. The local sheriff, Charles Reeder, quickly made the decision to call in the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, and the case escalated into what then Attorney General Mike Dewey DeWine would later describe as arguably the largest and most complex homicide investigation in the state's history. The crime scenes were spread out across several miles, yet chillingly similar in their execution. Most victims had been shot multiple times, many in their beds, some showing signs of bruising, as if they had been beaten prior to or during the shootings. The killers had moved with stealth and precision, meticulous in their efforts to avoid detection, collecting shell casings at most scenes and attempting to disable or remove surveillance systems. At Chris's Sr. his home, for instance, wires to a camera system were found cut, and blood evidence suggested the killers had entered the garage specifically to remove recordings after committing the murders. At Frankie and Hannah Gillies' trailer, there were signs of an attempted forced entry on the front door, though a back window was found open. Investigators doubted entry was gained that way due to the undisturbed items beneath it. The discovery of different types of shell casings across the scenes indicated that multiple weapons had been used, and very likely that there were multiple shooters involved in this coordinated attack. The initial discovery of a large-scale, sophisticated marijuana growing operation at 3 of the 4 crime scenes, involving hundreds of plants, led to early and widespread speculation that the massacre was a drug cartel hit, perhaps retaliation or a deal gone wrong. Pike County, like many rural Appalachian areas, faced significant economic challenges, including higher than average poverty rates and underemployment. And while illicit drug operations were not unheard of, they were not typically linked to this level of organized, execution-style violence. For months, this cartel theory dominated public perception and media coverage, painting a picture of a rural community caught in the crosshairs of dangerous outside forces. However, by the autumn of 2016, Sheriff Reeder and Attorney General DeWine began to publicly pivot away from the drug cartel narrative. They stated that their investigation was increasingly pointing towards a personal motive, and that the suspects were likely local, individuals who were familiar with the victims, their homes, and their daily routines. Suspicion eventually, and intensely, centered on the Wagner family, who had previously maintained close, almost intertwined, ties with several members of the Rhoden family. The primary connection, and the eventual flashpoint, was 2-year-old Sophia, the daughter of Edward Jake Wagner and the murdered Hanna Mae Rhoden. The Wagners, Patriarch George Billy Wagner III, his controlling wife Angela, and their 2 adult sons, George Wagner IV and Jake Wagner, had made a seemingly abrupt decision to sell their large farm in Pike County and move to Alaska shortly after the murders. a move that raised considerable suspicion. The core of the dispute, investigators came to believe, was a bitter, protracted, and increasingly obsessive battle over Sophia's custody. Hanna Mae Rhoden had reportedly refused to sign over full and permanent custody of Sophia to Jake and his domineering mother, Angela, even defiantly stating to friends, according to reports, "They will have to kill me first." A chillingly prophetic declaration. The investigation into the Wagners was painstaking and multifaceted. BCI agents sifted through enormous amounts of potential evidence, including shoe prints found in the mud at Chris Sr.'s home. Persistent detective work and analysis of retail records eventually led them to surveillance footage from a Walmart, which showed Angela Wagner purchasing 2 pairs of cheap, Velcro-fastened athletic shoes identical to those that left the prints, just weeks before the murders. While Angela initially denied recognizing or buying the shoes when confronted by investigators, her story faltered when presented with the damning receipt and store footage. Furthermore, custody documents, supposedly signed by Hanna Mae Rhoden in 2014 when she was only 15 and Sophie was a year old. And while Jake and Hanna Mae were still together, granting Jake sole custody of Sophia in the event of Hanna Mae's death, were found among the Wagners' possessions. However, the embedded printer date on these documents betrayed their true origin, revealing they were actually drafted much later, just weeks before the killings, strongly suggesting they were forgeries created in anticipation of Hanna Mae's demise. Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, a notary public whose official stamp was on the documents, later testified under a plea deal that Angela had, in fact, stolen her notary stamp and asked her to lie about witnessing Hanna Mae's signature, implicating her further in the conspiracy. Wiretaps placed on the Wagners' cell phones and covert listening devices planted inside their vehicles after they moved to Alaska yielded some incriminating, albeit often muffled, coded, or frustratingly inaudible conversations. The most significant breakthrough, however, came as investigators meticulously pieced together forensic evidence. Shell casings found on the Wagner family's former property in Pike County, where they frequently engaged in target practice, were ballistically matched to casings recovered from the Rhoden crime scenes. This provided a crucial physical link between weapons fired on Wagner land and the bullets that ended 8 lives. Adding to this, a homemade, crudely effective silencer, constructed from a Maglite flashlight and metal washers, was discovered hidden in a well on the Wagner farm, apparently after an attempt to destroy it in a fire before its disposal. In November 2018, more than 2.5 years after the horrific massacre, 6 members of the extended Wagner family were arrested and indicted. Billy, Angela, Jake, and George Wagner IV were charged with planning and carrying out the murders, while Billy's mother, Frederica Wagner, and Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, faced lesser charges related to obstruction of justice, perjury, and forgery in connection with the cover-up. Prosecutors alleged the Wagners had meticulously and coldly conspired together, developing an elaborate, multi-stage plan to kill the 8 victims under the cover of darkness, and then carefully cover their tracks. Believing they could commit the perfect crime, they had studied the victims' habits, their daily routines, and the layouts of their homes. They knew where they slept. The seemingly solid wall of Wagner family denial began to crack on the 5th anniversary of the massacre. In April 2021, Jake Wagner, reportedly motivated by his grandmother Frederica's persistent pleas for honesty and perhaps the overwhelming weight of his guilt, made a surprise guilty plea to all 23 counts against him, including 8 charges of aggravated murder. In a stunning agreement with prosecutors, designed to spare himself and his remaining family members from facing the death penalty, Jake agreed to provide a full, unvarnished confession and testify truthfully against his parents and his older brother. George. Jake's chilling confession laid bare the horrifying details of the elaborate, ruthlessly planned, and cold-blooded murder plot. He described how he and his brother, George, had acquired a 2010 black GMC pickup truck specifically for the murders to avoid using any of their own registered vehicles. The brothers then modified the truck, building a false bed where they could be hidden when they first arrived at the crime scenes. Jake explained how his father, Billy, had made arrangements to meet with Chris Rhoden Sr. that night under a pretext. When Billy arrived at Chris's Sr.'s trailer, Jake and George, who had been concealed in the truck bed, rolled out into pre-planned positions under the truck, ready to take their first shots. Billy then lured Chris's Sr. to the front porch by asking Chris to call his Billy's cell phone, claiming he had misplaced it. That call, a crucial part of the plan, went through to Billy's phone, which, along with Jake's and George's phones, had been intentionally left back at their own house to create a false digital alibi in case their locations were tracked later. They methodically moved from property to property, disabling cameras where possible, collecting shell casings to remove evidence, and stealing the victims' cell phones when they were able to locate them. The brothers wore new Walmart sneakers, the ones Angela bought on their feet, dark clothing, and face masks to conceal their identities. Jake Wagner admitted to personally killing 5 of the 8 victims, his former girlfriend and the mother of his child: Hanna Mae Rhoden, Frankie Rhoden, Hanna Hazel Gilley, Christopher Rhoden Jr., and Dana Rhoden. He stated that his father, Billy Wagner, killed Gary Rhoden and Kenneth Rhoden, and that both Jake and Billy shot Chris Rhoden Sr. After the initial killings at Chris Sr.'s trailer, Jake described how he entered the garage to disable the camera system. After walking over to the next trailer on foot, Jake broke into Frankie and Hanna Gilley's home through a window when his knife failed to pry open their front door. He confessed to murdering the young couple as they slept inside. At the third crime scene, the home of Dana Rhoden, Jake stated that all 3 men, himself, Billy, and George, entered the home. As the door had been found unlocked, there, Jake was responsible for the murders of Dana, Chris Jr., and Hanna Mae, the mother of his own child. He recounted how they then drove Chris Sr.'s truck the 5+ miles to Kenneth Rhoden's home, a calculated move in case they were spotted on the road or by Kenneth himself as they pulled into his drive. Billy Wagner had then entered Kenneth's home alone. The brothers, waiting outside, saw a flash from inside the house, and their father returned moments later. The next day, Billy Wagner delivered the black pickup truck used in the murders to a family member as a gift. This relative promptly registered the truck in her name, thereby effectively bypassing any official record of the Wagner men ever having possession or ownership of the vehicle. Together, Jake and George dug a large hole on their family property to temporarily conceal the murder weapons, including Jake's Colt .22 and the SKS rifle that George had carried that night. They would later move many of these weapons and other evidence to different locations, also burning clothing and other items in a burn pit on their farm, from which investigators later recovered and collected burned electronic devices. Jake Wagner eventually led investigators to cement-filled buckets, which the men had used to hide the murder weapons and ammunition. In a final, macabre act of concealment, these buckets were then put into a pond on a relative's property, serving as submerged anchors for a goose house the brothers had ostensibly given their grandfather as a birthday present. Much of Jake's detailed confession aligned precisely with elements of the crime that investigators had already painstakingly deduced, but it also provided a wealth of new, crucial information. Investigators, for instance, had not previously known about the specific truck used in the commission of the murders. They had also searched the sprawling Wagner family property for days and admitted it was unlikely they would ever have found the cement-filled buckets without Jake's cooperation. Most critically, until Jake's confession, they did not definitively know who exactly was present at each of the 4 crime scenes and who had pulled the trigger for each victim. On this vital point, they now had Jake Wagner's sworn word. Following Jake's damning plea and detailed cooperation, his mother, Angela Wagner, also took a plea deal in September 2021. She admitted guilt for her significant part in the meticulous planning of the murders. Though not for the physical execution of them, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, obstruction of justice, and nearly a dozen other related charges. In her plea agreement, Angela Wagner agreed to testify truthfully against her husband Billy and her other son George, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. George Wagner, III, however, chose to maintain his innocence and proceeded to trial in September 2022. The state argued that George was undeniably complicit in the murders, actively involved from the earliest planning stages through to the attempted cover-up of the evidence. He was, they asserted, just as guilty as his brother Jake, whether he had personally pulled the trigger on every victim or not. Both Jake and Angela, as per their plea agreements, testified against George, providing devastating details to the court about how the murders had been meticulously planned and brutally executed. According to Jake, it was primarily he and his father, Billy, who had formulated the core plan to murder Hanna May and her family. It was Billy, he said, who had given specific instructions to Angela to make certain purchases like the shoes and the cell phone jammer. And it was Billy who had mapped out precisely how the crime would play out on that fateful night. At the dark heart of the Wagner family's demands to take Sophia from Hanna May was their obsessive belief, likely entirely imagined, fueled, and grossly exaggerated by Angela, that young Sophia had been or was going to be abused by a member of the Rhoden family. There was no credible evidence ever presented to support these claims. They did not think that she, Hanna May, had done anything wrong to Sophia, one prosecutor noted. But they felt that when she was with her, that Hanna was bringing her up against people that she shouldn't. And again, the reality of those fears is highly questionable. But that was their distorted perception, their self-justification. So, Hanna May died that night because she refused to be manipulated by the Wagners, because she courageously refused to sign the forged paperwork, giving them full custody of her child. Jake had even suggested at one point that perhaps they could simply murder Hanna May and her new boyfriend, if she had one, and then stage the scene to appear as a murder-suicide. This initial, somewhat simpler plan was reportedly rejected by other family members as insufficient. When they did finally agree on a more comprehensive plan, it was based on the chilling premise that if Hanna May alone was killed, her relatives would immediately know who was responsible and would undoubtedly come after Jake and the rest of the Wagner family. So, they coldly posited that Hanna's father, Chris Sr., her protective uncle Kenneth, and her older brother Frankie, who was misidentified as older in some plans, but was still a target, needed to be added to their hit list to eliminate potential retaliation. Hanna May's other family members who were killed that night, Dana, Chris Jr., and Hannah Hazel Gilly, were, in the horrifying calculus of the Wagners, simply collateral damage, potential witnesses who were in the wrong place at the wrong time and so also tragically lost their lives. The jury in George Wagner IV's trial saw dozens of bank statements which painted a clear picture that the Wagner family routinely intermingled their finances to the point where Angela would often use her son's credit and bank cards to buy items, some of which were used to carry out the murders, even if her sons did not know the exact sinister purpose of every purchase she made. They had effectively given her free rein of their accounts. Prosecutors presented concrete evidence that Angela Wagner bought a cell phone jammer and a bug detector, items used during the commission of the killings, using George's credit card. The item was quite expensive, almost $600, and ordered from China. When this unusual purchase was made, the fraud department of the credit card company actually called George Wagner IV to ensure that he had authorized the purchase online. And he had. The trial saw 2.5 grueling months of testimony. Jurors heard about the extensive and often sordid criminal history of the Wagner family, including instances of theft, multiple suspicious fires in which their homes were burnt down, presumably for insurance claims, Billy Wagner's documented drug issues, and other disturbing behavior that painted a picture of a family unit that was insular, deeply selfish, morally corrupt, and habitually criminal. The state effectively portrayed a family that operated outside the normal bounds of societal law and empathy, as the defense argued that it was not George's fault that he had been born a Wagner. Jurors also heard from his ex-wife, Tabitha, whose own experience with the Wagner family mirrored Hanna Rhoden's in many chilling ways. Tabitha recounted how she escaped her unhappy marriage to George and the oppressive Wagner home by literally running from the house while Angela Wagner allegedly searched for her shotgun. But Tabitha, unlike Hanna May, did not have a strong family support system, and the Wagners had successfully and coercively convinced her to sign over custody of her son with George, named Bovine, to them. Before Hanna May had been killed, Tabitha had reportedly warned the young mother never to make the same mistake that she did. George Wagner IV took the stand in his own defense, claiming he was not even present when the murders took place, asserting he had gone to bed around 10 p.m. that night and knew nothing of his father and brother leaving. However, the prosecution argued that even if he wasn't the primary shooter in every instance, his participation in the planning, the acquisition of tools for the crime like authorizing the jammer purchase, helping construct the false truck bed, and being present at the scenes made him complicit. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted George Wagner IV on all 22 counts against him, including 8 charges of aggravated murder. His sentencing was scheduled for December 19, 2022. George was spared a potential death sentence because of the plea deals his brother Jake and mother Angela took, which required their testimony. His son, Bovine, was subsequently returned to the custody of his mother, Tabitha. Billy Wagner, the patriarch of the family and allegedly a key architect of the massacre, is the last remaining core family member to face charges as of the production of this documentary. His case was expected to go to trial in 2023. The 2 grandmothers, Frederica Wagner and Rita Newcomb, faced lesser charges. Rita Newcomb pleaded guilty to obstructing justice for her role in the forged custody documents. Frederica Wagner initially pleaded not guilty to obstruction and perjury charges related to bulletproof vests found in her home, which she claimed to have bought after the killings for protection, but later also took a plea, adding another layer of complexity and public distrust to the handling of this monumental case. The initial lead investigator, Pike County Sheriff Charles Reeder, was himself sentenced to 3 years in prison in March 2021. He pleaded guilty to unrelated charges of theft in office and tampering with evidence, admitting he used his office to steal thousands of dollars that had been confiscated as evidence in other drug cases. While there was no direct evidence linking any corruption or evidence tampering specifically to the Rhoden murder case investigation, his conviction inevitably cast a shadow over the early handling of the case and raised questions about the overall competency and integrity within the sheriff's department at the time. The Pike County Massacre stands as a chilling testament to the terrifying depths of familial betrayal, the devastating consequences of disputes fueled by obsession, manipulation, and a pathological need for control. It tore apart a rural community, exposed a dark underbelly of calculated criminality within a seemingly ordinary family and left a legacy of profound, unimaginable loss and questions that, for some, particularly the surviving children who lost their parents and so many relatives that horrific night, may never be fully or satisfactorily answered. Thank you for joining me as we've examined this sprawling, intricate, and deeply tragic case. It's a stark reminder of the complex human emotions that can drive individuals to commit unspeakable acts, the incredible dedication required by law enforcement to unravel such complex crimes, and the painstaking, often agonizing, efforts required to bring some measure of justice in the face of such calculated and widespread evil. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.